Somewhere within a few miles of you right now, there is a building full of people whose entire profession is deciding what to do with a dead body. Think about how strange that is for a second. We take the person and we don't just deal with it. We wash them. We do their hair. We put them in an outfit, a good outfit, the nice shirt, sometimes shoes, for an event they will not, in any meaningful sense, be attending. We pump them full of preservatives so they look like they're sleeping. Then we lower them into the ground inside a sealed box that, depending on the box, can cost more than the car in your driveway. We carve their name into stone, with the 2 dates and a little dash standing in for the whole life between them. And we plant that stone in a field we'll keep mowing for the next 100 years. We take out an ad in the newspaper to tell strangers it happened. Entire professions, licenses, price lists, a whole economy grew up around one stubborn problem. What to do with a person once they're gone, and the body is still here. No other animal on Earth does a single piece of that. Not one. A dog will sniff at a dead companion and eventually move on. That's the whole ceremony. And yet, somewhere back in the deep past, a creature that was not quite us stopped moving on. Something happened, and a body stopped being a thing to walk away from and started being a thing to carry, to place, to keep. When did that switch flip? And why did it flip in us? Or, as it turns out, in more than just us. I'll be honest about the tone up front, because this is a question with a body count. Some of it is funny, in the way human beings are funny. Some of it is going to sit heavy, because it's about the thing every one of us is eventually going to be on the wrong side of. Both are true at once. That's the deal with this one. The obvious story, the one you've probably absorbed without ever being taught it directly, is that burial is a religious thing. That somewhere along the line, humans got souls, or the idea of souls, started believing in an afterlife, and decided the dead needed to be sent off properly for the journey. Bodies in the ground, treasure for the next world, prayers over the grave, burial as the physical shadow of belief. It's a clean story, and it makes the elaborate box, and the nice shoes make sense. You're preparing someone for somewhere. For the famous textbook burials, the ones covered in red pigment with gifts tucked beside the body, that story holds up beautifully. There's just one problem with it, and it's a big one. It's the timeline. The moment you go looking for when this behavior actually starts, it refuses to line up with when religion, or symbols, or anything we'd call belief could possibly have existed. Walk it forward the way most people picture it. Anatomically modern humans, us, show up in Africa a couple 100,000 years ago. Somewhere in there we get language, art, symbolic thought, the whole cognitive package. And then, the story goes, once we're fully us, we start burying our dead with meaning. Beads, ochre, ritual. That's the version where burial is the graduation certificate of the modern mind, proof that we'd finally become the kind of creature that thinks about death and does something about it. I want to be fair to that version, because it isn't stupid. The most spectacular early burials really are ours, and they really are loaded with symbolism. If your only evidence were the greatest hits, you'd land on exactly this. But the greatest hits aren't the beginning. They're the middle. When archaeologists trace the behavior backward, not the beads, not the ceremony, just the raw act of deliberately placing the dead somewhere instead of leaving them, they keep finding it earlier, and earlier. And then they find it somewhere the whole story falls apart, in a stretch of time so far back that us is not a word that applies yet. No symbols there. No art. Nobody who could have believed in an afterlife in any sense we'd recognize. And the dead were still being carried, deliberately, into the dark. That's the part almost nobody outside the field talks about. The famous burials get the documentaries. The thing that came hundreds of thousands of years before them sits at the bottom of a pit in northern Spain that most people have never heard of. The pit has a name that tells you exactly what's in it. Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. It sits deep inside a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains near Burgos. And to reach the chamber where the bones are, you go down a vertical shaft, a 13-meter drop, about the height of a 4-story building, straight down through the rock in total darkness. That's the only way in. It was the only way in back then too. At the bottom of that shaft, researchers have pulled out more than 6,000 human bones. At least 28 individuals. Men, women, children. All in the same, impossible-to-reach place. And here's the number that should stop you cold. They date to around 430,000 years ago. Sit with that, because it's hard to hold. 430,000 years. That's before our species existed. Homo sapiens wouldn't show up for another 200,000 years or more. It's before cave painting, before language as we'd know it, before anything you could point to and call a religion. These weren't people like us. They were an older kind of human, Homo heidelbergensis, ancestors of the Neanderthals, with different faces, different skulls, and no reason on paper to care what happened to a corpse. And they carried their dead to the edge of that shaft and put them in. 28 of them, over time, in the one spot in the whole landscape that took real effort to reach and served no practical purpose whatsoever. That is the earliest evidence we have of any human ancestor treating the dead as something other than garbage. And it's nearly 500,000 years old. The religion story doesn't just get pushed back by this. It gets its foundation kicked out from under it. Now the obvious objection, and it's a good one, is that a pit is a pit. Bodies fall into holes. Maybe these people just tumbled down the shaft one unlucky soul at a time, or a flood washed them in, and there's nothing tender about it at all. Scientists had that same thought, and they went looking. Juan Luis Arzuaga, who has spent decades running the Atapuerca excavations, worked the problem from several angles. Start with the animals. If this were a natural trap, a hole things fall into, you'd expect the bones of everything that lives nearby. Foxes, deer, the usual victims of a pit in the ground. That's not what's down there. The chamber is overwhelmingly human. Whatever was collecting bodies here was picky in a way nature isn't. Then there's the makeup of the group. A natural death trap tends to catch the careless and the frail, a scatter of the very young and the very old, whoever wanders in. The Sima dead don't fit that shape. They skew toward teenagers and young adults, which is not who falls down holes. It's who gets carried by the people who love them. And then, the single strangest object in the whole pit. Among all those thousands of bones, the team found exactly one tool. One. A handaxe, beautifully made, napped from red quartzite that doesn't match the ordinary stone the group used for everyday work. They nicknamed it Excalibur. It has no use marks, no wear, no sign it was ever swung at anything. A perfect, unused, deliberately special object, resting at the bottom of a shaft full of the dead. You can feel the argument tightening. No animals where animals should be. The wrong ages for an accident. One exquisite, purposeless gift left in the dark. None of that proves a funeral you could film. But it's exactly the pattern you'd expect the first time a body became something worth an effort. Something you don't just leave. And a darker detail makes the carrying even harder to wave off. One of the skulls from the pit, the researchers call it Cranium 17, was pieced back together from dozens of shattered fragments and studied by Nohemi Salah with the tools of a modern forensic investigator. Above the left eye sit 2 puncture wounds, side by side, the same shape, angled the same way. Not one unlucky impact. 2 matching blows from the same object delivered on purpose. It reads, as closely as a case this old can, like one of the first murders we know about. And afterward, that body was carried to the mouth of the shaft with all the others. Whatever these people were, they hurt each other. And they still would not leave each other where they fell. Push forward a few 100,000 years, and the picture gets richer, and also messier in a way worth being honest about. By the time the Neanderthals are around, the dead are clearly being handled with something like care. And the most famous example of it doubles as a cautionary tale about how easily we read our own hopes into old dirt. In the 1950s, an archaeologist named Ralph Solecki was digging in Shanidar Cave in the mountains of what's now Iraqi Kurdistan and found a cluster of Neanderthal skeletons. Around one of them, soil samples came back full of clumped pollen from bright wildflowers. Solecki drew the beautiful, obvious conclusion. This Neanderthal had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers, mourned, decorated. He wrote a whole book about it. The Neanderthals stopped being the shuffling brutes of the old cartoons and became, overnight, people who grieved. Lovely story. It's probably also wrong, at least about the flowers. When later researchers went back over the evidence, the pollen turned out to have plenty of innocent explanations. Bees nesting in the sediment, burrowing rodents dragging flower heads underground. Pollen tracked in on the boots of the excavators themselves. The bed of flowers may have been a bee's pantry the entire time. But the part that stays with me is this. The science self-corrected, and the burial survived it. A team led by Emma Pomeroy at Cambridge has been re-excavating that same cave over the past few years and found more bodies in the exact same spot. Not scattered, clustered, placed. One of the newly found individuals and one of Solecki's lie in the same position, heads pointed the same way, tucked behind a big fallen rock that could have marked the place. Strip out the flowers and you still can't explain that with an accident. The Neanderthals were coming back to the same patch of ground, again and again, to lay their people down the same way. The romance was overstated. The care was not. Only now, and I mean only now, hundreds of thousands of years into this story, do we reach the part where the religion version turns out to be right. Somewhere between 90 and 100,000 years ago, at a cave called Kafzeh in what's now northern Israel, here at last are people exactly like you. Homo sapiens. Our species, our brains, our symbols. And they buried their dead the way the textbook wants them to. In one grave, an adolescent, a kid, 12 or 13, was laid carefully on their back in a shallow pit, knees drawn up. Placed across the child's pelvis, on purpose, were the antlers of a fallow deer. The soil around the body was soaked in red ochre, the rust-colored pigment, the color of blood, carried in and ground down and spread across the grave. At a sister site on Mount Carmel, another body was found cradling the jawbone of a wild boar against its chest. Antlers, red pigment, a gift held to the heart. There's no way to explain deer antlers laid on a dead child as a practical act. That is symbolism. That is a message. This person mattered. This person is going somewhere. This person needs to be sent. This is the afterlife showing up in the record, more or less on schedule, with everything you were ever taught. But look at where we are on the timeline. The ochre and the antlers are around 100,000 years old. The pit of bones in Spain is 4 times older than that. So the symbolic, sending off kind of burial, the kind the whole popular story is built on, didn't invent the behavior. It arrived to a behavior that was already unthinkably ancient. Our ancestors weren't doing something new when they painted that grave red. They were dressing up something they'd been doing, in some raw and wordless form, for 250,000 years before anyone thought to reach for the ochre. And keep one thing in mind about all of this, because it changes how you read the empty stretches. What survives 400,000 years is a cruel lottery. Stone survives. A deep sealed shaft survives. Bone, in the right cave chemistry, survives. Almost nothing else does. Flesh, wood, woven grass. A body laid gently in soft ground under the open sky. All of it rots and disappears, usually within a few thousand years, leaving nothing an archaeologist could ever find. So the handful of sites we have aren't a record of when this behavior happened. They're a record of where the ground happened to keep the receipt. Every one of them is a lucky accident of preservation, which means the real beginning almost certainly sits earlier than anything will ever pull out of the dirt. One more site cracks the story wide open, if it holds up. I want to flag that "if" loudly, because this is the most fiercely argued claim in the field right now, and I won't pretend the fight is settled. Deep in a cave system near Johannesburg called Rising Star, a team led by the paleoanthropologist Lee Berger found the bones of a creature that shouldn't be there at all. A human relative called Homo Naledi, placing its dead in that cave, by Berger's reckoning, somewhere between 230 and 330,000 years ago. The bones sit at the far end of a brutal underground route. Narrow chutes, total darkness, passages so tight the scientists who reached them had to be small enough to squeeze through. You do not end up back there by accident, and no flood carried you. Berger has been open about the question that haunted the whole project. Could these just be individuals who crawled in, got lost, and died where they lay? Maybe. But then you have to explain why it keeps happening. Multiple bodies, over time, in the same near inaccessible pocket of the cave, and almost nowhere else. Getting lost is a story you can tell once. It's a much worse fit for a pattern. And here's what makes people either lean in or scoff. Homo naledi had a brain about the size of an orange, under 600 cubic centimeters, roughly a third of yours, no bigger than a chimpanzee's. This is not a creature anyone would have bet was capable of ceremony. Every version of the story, where you need a big symbol-making brain to care about death, says Naledi should not be doing this. Plenty of serious scientists think Berger's team has run ahead of the evidence, that the bodies could have piled up some other way, that deliberate burial is a much higher bar to clear than a scatter of bones in a deep chamber. That criticism is fair, and for now, the question is wide open. But sit with what the argument itself is telling you. We are now, in peer-reviewed journals, seriously debating whether a small-brained cousin of ours, a third of a million years ago, carried its dead into the deepest dark it could find. The fact that this is a real question, and not an obvious no, that's the whole point. The pull to not abandon the dead may run further down the family tree than anyone was ready to believe. So step back and look at the shape of the whole thing. The story we tell ourselves is that we buried the dead because we believed. The evidence points the other way. The burying came first, hundreds of thousands of years first, in creatures that weren't us, one of them with a brain a fraction of ours. The belief, the ochre, the antlers, the idea of a journey and a place to send someone. All of that came after. It looks less like religion produced the burial, and more like the burial was already sitting there, wordless and ancient, waiting for us to invent stories big enough to explain what we already couldn't stop doing. And you can't stop doing it either. That's the part that closes the distance. Think about what you actually do when someone you love dies. Not what you believe. What you do. With your hands and your hours. You sit with the body. You don't want to leave it alone in the room. You keep their number in your phone for years, and you cannot make your thumb delete it. You save a voicemail so you can still hear the voice. You go back to a particular patch of ground on particular days, and you stand there, even though every rational part of you knows the person is not in the dirt. You bring flowers. Real ones this time. None of that is practical. None of it does anything. The way a chore does something. It is the exact behavior of those hominins at the edge of the shaft in Spain. The refusal to treat a body as a thing. The pull to carry it somewhere and keep it and come back. You share that pull with a species that vanished before your species was born. When you can't delete the number, you're doing something 400,000 years old. The dead don't need any of it. They never did. The Neanderthal behind his marker stone didn't need the spot, and the child under the antlers didn't need the deer. The burying was never really for them. It was for the ones left standing there, holding a body, unable to walk away. That was true at the bottom of the pit of bones. It's true at every funeral you will ever go to. If you've got one of those things, a number you won't delete, a place you keep going back to, some small keeping that makes no sense, I'd like to hear what it is. Whatever it is, it might be the oldest thing about you, and there's something worth saying out loud in the fact that you were never the first to do it. Not by a few 100,000 years.